Okay, so as I like to do, I'm going to go back to chapter 13 if I can get my screen here in the right place. And we're going to just kind of do a quick um, review, if you will, of chapter 13 to bring us up to where we are in chapter 14.
Mr. Dowd,
'Cause yes,
that the letter is very small. I can't see it.
well, let's see if we can change that. Is
Thank
that
you.
better?
It's improved, yes.
Okay. All right, so in chapter 13, Paul was discussing a couple of ideas, as you see there on the subheads, the submission to authority and then fulfilling the law through love, service, as I would put it. Um, Romans carries a lot of themes from other letters that Paul wrote, in that he was just dealing with common things, if you will. And part of it was the Greek culture, the Roman culture that so many were coming out of, because Church of God was increasingly becoming more Gentile, if you will, not that is not coming from a Jewish primarily background that started in Acts 2 and so forth. Um, and so he's having to deal with things as they bump up against the culture. Um, and even in terms of authority, having that proper deference, because God does allow for the establishing of governments and authority and so forth, to not disparage that it carries over into our calling. And so he's talking about those aspects as well, which even spills into the church, if you will. But then also how living up to the law, living in the law, reflects this love that God has. And so then we come to chapter 14, and Paul picks up some thoughts um, in terms of going back to what he's covered in other letters, for instance, in First Corinthians, where he's talking about the aspect of food and specifically meat. And I'll get more into that in a moment. But they had to come to a point of understanding the practicality of the law, what God is asking us to do and what he's not asking us to do, and how we can get kind of stuck in a checklist mentality if we're not very careful. This is what the Pharisees got stuck in. And while their desire to obey the law was commendable, they had made it so onerous that they took love and they took mercy out of any aspect of calling, and they began to do a lot of things that Paul is addressing. Now, that's just human nature. It's a human nature apart from God's spirit, and the church in general would continue to deal with that, if you will, in the right way of learning how to grow in the proper way that doesn't dismiss God's instruction, but also understands there's also a bigger picture in terms of how we treat one another, how we uh, show, if you will, by example, God's nature and what that means in terms of what he's bringing us to become. So in chapter 14, then he starts with going back to an aspect of judging one another. And this gets to be very easy, if you will, because of human nature. If we think that we're right, that we've read a passage, we understand a section of scripture, we've been taught a certain way, that that's the only way to do something. And so this ties into the comment I made a moment ago about the meat. Some call them shambles. There's another word actually that's used in the Greek where it's called oh, Macellum. Sorry, Macellum was the meat market. And so as the pagans, the Romans, would bring offerings to their gods, they could bring any number of things that would be called the fruit of the land. It could be flowers, it could be honey, it could be these other sort of things. We typically think of offerings in terms of what God asked Israel to do, and that primarily involved clean animals. But in the Roman pagan world, that wasn't the case. Sometimes it would involve meat. But even when it involved meat, of course, God's instruction in sacrificial law was what's called the clean animals in Leviticus. Um, and he was very specific about that. But in the pagan world, that wasn't the case. You could bring pretty much any animal. You could bring a chicken. You could bring a cow. Typically, beef was not what was sacrificed because that was a very valuable animal. Oxen were used in transport. They were expensive to raise. You had to have land. You had to invest years of that animal growing, being taken care of. And so it was very expensive. Not that it wasn't done, it's just very expensive. the more common sacrifice actually was pork, because pork is cheap. Pigs are almost carefree. You really don't have to take care of pigs. They will eat whatever. They're designed to be garbage disposals. And so they're not on a particular diet. Like oxen, you need a lot of field, as I mentioned, for grass. You need water, and that's pretty much it. Pigs will eat anything. They'll eat scraps, they'll eat dead things, they'll eat whatever's available on the land, they'll root, they'll find roots, they'll find bulbs, they'll just eat anything. And because of that, they grow very quickly. You can turn around pigs within a year to have meat to eat, to have meat to offer. And so what would happen is the Romans would bring these offerings to the temple, and in the course of, especially with animals, obviously, butchering the animals, not all of what was offered to the gods was used. And actually, primarily in the pagan world, again, it was not the best. God says, bring me your best, right? Bring animals that are not diseased, animals that don't have broken legs, animals that are whole, that because of what it represents. In the Roman pagan world, that was not the case. And in most cases, what was offered to the gods was what they couldn't eat, right? So it'd be the innards, it would be the portions that they wouldn't eat, like the heads, these different things. And so the rest of the meat, as it was butchered, would be set aside and it would go to the meat market to be sold. And this is what many are struggling against. They're struggling, can I go to the meat market and buy beef? Can I buy chicken? Can I buy lamb if it's sitting in the stall next to the pork? Because in their mind, if it's associated with two things, if it's associated with offerings to the gods, no, right? They see it as tainted that way. And then also they say, well, it's sitting right next to the pork. Now it's not cooked together, it's just sitting there raw. But they say, well, it's contaminated by presence, by proximity. And so some struggled with this. Others said, no, it doesn't matter, right? Which is what Paul ends up addressing here as we get into it. And some were like, well, you know what? I'm just going to avoid that whole discussion, and I'm not going to eat meat at all. I'll just eat vegetables. Okay, so if each person makes that judgment, which is what Paul goes through, he says, that's your conscience. That's fine. But when you take that then and start judging the spiritual standard, level of anyone else, now you're getting into bad territory. So Romans 14 and verse 1, he says, now accept one who is weak in faith, but not for disputes over opinions. Meaning, don't accept someone weak in faith who disputes over opinions. Right? So when we get into arguments over these kind of things, Paul's saying, that's not good. Don't do that. And in 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 9, he makes a similar statement, but beware lest somehow this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to those that are weak. And so they would have these contentions and divisions over, could I eat the meat because of offering to the gods? Could I eat the meat because of the proximity to meat that's not good to eat? Or should I just avoid it all? And they became very polarized in their positions. And Paul's saying, don't do that. Verse 2, one man has faith to eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. So a sub-point here that many will take out of context is that Paul is saying everything's good to eat. That's not what he's saying. Because he also says in another place, follow me as I follow Christ. We never find Paul specifically saying you can eat whatever you want. They're assuming that because of the language, and they're not understanding the context. Who is he speaking to? He's speaking to the church of God. He's speaking to the church members, to use our vernacular. And he's not discounting what Christ taught. Christ taught the food laws. Christ gave the food laws to Israel in the Old Testament. So we can frame this, if you will, in saying the one man has faith to eat all things that are okay to eat. So we have to make sure that we're clear there. Many will also then take out of context Acts 10, where Paul goes to Cornelius and he has the vision, if you remember, of all the different animals coming down in the sheet, clean and unclean. And the angel says in the vision, rise, eat. He says, No, Lord, I've not so done. He says, well, no man shall call common things that are uncommon things that I've made clean. And then they miss a couple of verses later where he's speaking of men. He's not speaking of animals. The vision was just the vehicle to make the point. So don't let people twist you in this. This is not what Paul's talking about here. He's not talking about the food laws. He's talking about judging. And while the food laws play into why there was judging, he's not addressing the food laws directly, but indirectly. And so verse 3 here, he says, don't let him who eats despise him who doesn't eat. So one guy says, no, I can't do that. I can't go to the meat markets because it's just going to bother me. Doesn't mean he can't go butcher his own chicken or lamb or cow or whatever, or not eat it at all. But Paul is saying, don't despise that. Don't let him who doesn't eat judge him who eats, for God has accepted him. It's God who has the right, if you will, to say what a person is doing and whether it's proper or not, right? We fall under God's mercy through the sacrifice of Christ. Paul gets into this, we'll come to this in a little bit later, where he says, who are you to judge another man's servant? Right? It's not ours to judge. Now, we should have the standard. We should hold ourselves to the standard. And maybe at times we say to someone else, are you sure that's the way because of this, that, and the other? But it is not our job to judge for salvation. And that's where they were getting themselves twisted up and they were creating these problems. So in Colossians 2, verse 16, Paul writes this. He says, so let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. And again, people will twist that, saying what Paul is saying, because you've rejected all those things, because Christ has fulfilled them and you don't do them, don't let people judge you. No, he's speaking to the church because these members were being judged by the culture, right? These are Colossians, these are Romans, these are Corinthians. They're coming out of the culture and their family is saying, wait, what are you doing? Right? And here in Colossians 2:16, festival or new moon or Sabbath, they were keeping. They were being judged by others. The point is the same. Don't judge, right? They had no right to judge in or out of the church. So going back to Romans 14:4, he says, who are you to judge another servant? Right? So who judges me? Who judges you? Who judges anyone that comes under the baptism of Jesus Christ? God does. God is only the one who has that right. Now, he gives that responsibility later. We can read in Revelation. He gives that to Jesus Christ, but ultimately is the authority of God alone. So he said, it's not yours to have. To his own Lord, he stands or falls, meaning me, right? When you or I stand before God, we stand before our Lord, Jesus Christ. And we either stand or we fall. We don't stand or fall between other people. Now we can stumble, and he gets to that point later on. We can cause others to stumble. That's not a light thing to consider. But he says, ultimately, it's us. He says, yes, each of us, will be made to stand, for God has the power to make him stand. Right? God, it's the sacrifice of Christ that allows us to come under that judgment in the right way, to know what's being judged, and to have striven or not to make sure that we're living up to that standard. And so even as I read Colossians 2:16, he comes back to this thought similarly here in Romans 14, verse 5. One man esteems one day as important, another day esteems every day alike. Let each man be fully assured in his own mind. Now, you could look at the cultural context, as I mentioned, from Colossians 2, but this is internal. So what was happening is that some would say, I am going to fast this day. That day is important. Or some would say, it's important for me to maybe have a special cut of meat on the Sabbath day to help make it special. Whatever it happened to be. Certain days could be set aside for these things. And so he says, let each man be fully assured in his own mind. Your reasons have to be valid for yourself, right? You have to live up to that. I have the word alike stricken out there because in the Greek it's not there. Another esteems every day. right? One says only one day, whatever it happens to be, the first of the month, I'm going to do this, or another says it doesn't matter. So verse 6, he who observes the day observes it, to the Lord. And he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he who gives thanks. For he who doesn't eat, to the Lord he doesn't eat, and God gives thanks. So some will twist this to say Paul's talking about the Sabbath. There's no mention of the Sabbath in here at all. Paul's not talking about the Sabbath. He's addressing what people choose to eat or not choose to eat, when they choose to eat or when they don't choose to eat it. He's talking about food here in the context of judging. So again, don't let people twist this verse into saying something it doesn't address. I have 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31 there, so let me go back and read that to you. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31, Paul writes, therefore, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Right? Not to our own glory. This is another point he's trying to drive home here. You can choose to do whatever you want. I knew a lady years and years ago in Cincinnati when I was a boy, and I don't know how it came up. She was not bragging about it, it just happened to come up. First day of the month, no matter what day that was, she fasted. It was her practice. She wanted to do that monthly. And that's a really good thing. It's a really good habit to have. It was sort of her way of refocusing as she looked into the next month to making sure she had her mind in the right place and was doing the right things. This is what Paul's talking about here. This is what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. Do it to the glory of God, not to judge other people, not to hold myself up to a standard. Again, this is what Paul addressed even when he was talking about the gifts that were given in 1 Corinthians, right? They were abusing those gifts. They were using as hammers to pound each other and judge each other. That's why he wrote 1 Corinthians 13. Look, you're missing the whole point. The gifts are great, but what's the most important thing here? And so he's reminding them similarly here. So verse 7, for none of us lives to himself, and none dies to himself, right? In terms of judgment, I don't live because I've judged myself righteously. I don't die because I judged myself as having failed. That, again, goes back to what we touched on earlier. That's only for Christ when he judges. So if we extend that outside of ourselves, it's not for us to judge others, either to life or to judgment, to death. Verse 8 here, Romans 14. For if we live to the Lord. Or if we die to the Lord. If therefore we live or die, we are the Lord's. Right? Reinforcing all these points we've touched on to this point. Are we living up to that? Is what Paul's asking, what he's writing here in this letter. And so again, he says in verse 10 what he said in verse 4. But you, why do you judge your brother? Why are you judging another man's servant? Nowhere in any instruction are we told to judge one another. We're actually told the opposite many, many, many times. Don't judge. And many have twisted that, unfortunately, in our modern culture, and most of them aren't even Christians that are making this point. Well, you can't judge anyone. That's not what God is saying. What he's saying is if we're going to judge someone else, this is Matthew 7, if we're going to judge someone else, we better make sure that we are living up to that standard. Because if we judge someone else according to that standard, then we're being judged against the same standard. We should rather seek God's mercy and then extend that mercy to others as well. Again, within context, we're not to tolerate sin. We're to be very clear in God's instruction from his word, but in terms of salvation is what I'm trying to reinforce here. So he comes back then to this. Why do you judge your brother? Verse 10. Or you again, why do you despise your brother? This is what was happening within the church in Rome. And why Paul's addressing this. They were judging one another to the point of despising each other. Well, you can't be very righteous. You're not going to be in the kingdom because you do X. I do Y. You should be like me. And then you get into this contention, this division that God hates. So he says, we all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And there are many Alexandrian manuscripts, then Bible scholars like those better because in terms of chronological dating of age, they're closer to the time of Christ. I only highlight this because some translations will say judgment seat of God, others say judgment seat of Christ. It doesn't really change the meaning. We'll stand in judgment. Verse 11, for it is written, as I live, says the Eternal, to me every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, right? Again, we don't answer to each other, we answer to God. That verse there in verse 11, that reference is Isaiah 45, verse 23. So Romans 14:12, Paul then says, so then each of us will give account to himself to God, right? This repetition is necessary to drive home the point because they were so steeped in this, you can't just mention it and pass on and expect they're going to understand. So he keeps coming back to this from different perspectives and different language, but the point is the same. Don't go down this path, right? Are we living up to being able to give an account for ourselves? That's what should be at the front of our mind, not whether someone else will or not. So then all of that brings to the point of then he sort of transitions here, not leaving that behind, because we'll come back to a couple of thoughts here where he goes back up to things he says earlier in this chapter. So he says, therefore, that's a summary statement. In light of all I just covered, let's not judge one another anymore, but judge this, right? So don't judge one another, but if you need to judge this, that no man put a stumbling block in his brother's way or an occasion for falling. Do we consider ourselves? We're back to that same thought then, aren't we? He hasn't really left it. He's just saying, okay, so now I'm going to put it in a different context. I'm going to say, are you causing someone else to stumble? Right? You could say, well, okay, I'm not judging him. He's just wrong. I'm going to do it anyway. So I've used the example in Roxanne's extended family. She has one brother, wasn't an alcoholic, but the religion that he is a part of, he's very faithful to it. I'm not taking exception with any of that, but he decided they were not going to drink alcohol anymore. So their house doesn't have any alcohol. They don't ever drink alcohol. Well, the rest of the family, in terms of being deferential, if you will, to that family, when we gather together, there's no alcohol. Now, some could say, well, that's them. I'm going to have a beer or I'm going to have whatever drink. No, we just don't bring it up. It's not necessary to have it in that context so that everybody can be at ease. And this is, I think, is the principle of what Paul is addressing. So in 1 Corinthians 14 and in verse 13, Paul writes this as well. Therefore, let him who speaks in tongues speaks in, I'm sorry. I must have the wrong reference. What am I trying to look for there? I'm sorry, I did something wrong in my notes. I'll have to go fix that later. But to not put this stumbling block. I was thinking of also the example of Christ about causing offense to a little one. And that reference in Matthew has to do with not just age, but it can also be experience. So even in the church, a young one in the faith, as we might say. So Romans 14, verse 14, Paul continues, I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean of itself, except that to him who considers anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. So again, this is where some will take this and they'll say, well, you can eat whatever you want. The Levitical instruction of what is food and what is not food doesn't apply anymore. Christ did away with all of that for us. You can go eat whatever, pork, shellfish, anything you want to eat. But that's not what he's referring to. Again, if I can insert a word here, that nothing is unclean of itself that is not unclean or is unclean, depending on how you want to look at it, right? He's not setting aside the food laws. He's saying if you go into a market and there's a piece of pork next to a piece of beef, it's okay, right? The pork doesn't magically make the beef unclean. Now, you could get into juices and you could get into being cooked together, these different things. But on a simple, high level thing, view of it, if you will, he's saying there's nothing magical there. Simply because somebody offered it to a God we know doesn't exist, doesn't now make it unfit to consume. Now, if you sat in the temple, this is what he addresses in 1 Corinthians. If you sit in the temple and eat it, then that's going to create a problem because people are going to think you're doing it to honor the gods, which is part of what they would do as well. Sometimes they would buy this meat, they would take it back to the temple, and they would have basically like a picnic, right? They'd eat before the gods to help with this interaction as they saw. So he's not talking about that either. He's saying if you're just looking at a piece of meat that's pork next to a piece of beef or chicken or lamb or whatever it is, he says it's okay, right? Nothing is unclean of itself. Verse 15, yet if because of food your brother is grieved. So a church member could see another church member go into the market. These are very public spaces. A lot of other business was done around these meat markets, buying and selling. It was almost like a town square, right? You could have different things going on in the middle of the square, but around the edges were all these different shops. It was the marketplace of the day, not just for food, many other items. And so you could see one member could see another member going in, and he knows there's pork in there. He knows there's meat that's been offered to the gods. And this church member goes in, he comes out with a package, and he's assuming whatever. It could be clean, it could be not clean, it could be food that shouldn't be eaten, it's food that's okay to be eaten, but he's judging that. And he says that's a problem. What Paul is saying, if you know your brother's going to think that, right? If it's going to create an issue for him, you no longer walk in love. Because it's creating an issue in this brother's mind. Is it better to use my family analogy? Is it better not to have the beer? Or to force the issue and say, no, I'm not the one with the problem? Why not just take it off the plate? There are probably other ways to get it. That would probably be the most convenient. But even today, if I didn't want to go into the supermarket and buy meat, I could find it somewhere else. I could go to a butcher shop, make sure that it's done okay. I could maybe even raise my own animals and butcher them myself. There'd be other ways to do it. And so he's saying, if you do this, then your love is outgoing concern, isn't it? You're no longer, he says, looking for your brother's welfare. You're just saying it doesn't matter. I'll do what I want or what I know is okay. So he said, don't destroy him with your food, him for whom Christ died. Don't let that be the issue that he says, you know what? I'm not going to do any of this. If this is the way people are going to be, why am I here? Right? I'm judged less in the world. I can just go do whatever. So Paul says, don't do that. As I have my notes there are times when it's better not to do something lawful. Paul even says that in other places, right? Everything is lawful, but not everything is expedient. Not everything does the right thing, if you will, provides the right outcome. I can be right and I can be wrong at the same time, depending on how I'm exercising it and how I'm interacting with people. So this responsibility, we're not islands. We're responsible for each other to a point. Again, what I say, what I do, as long as I'm doing it properly, then the onus is on the other person, but I should do everything I can to make sure I'm not causing offense or making a stumbling block for somebody. I gave a sermon at the feast and I had a joke in there. I didn't think it was disrespectful. It made the point I was trying to make. But somebody that reviewed my notes ahead of time asked me to take that joke off because they had a family member they thought would have been offended by that joke. I said, okay, I took the joke out. It didn't add or take away anything. It would have augmented my point, but it being missing, nobody would have known any differently if they'd not read my notes ahead of time. And I think this is part of what Paul's talking about here, right? Don't destroy your brother over food. Don't destroy your brother over fill in the blank, whatever else it is. Verse 16, don't let your good be slandered. Well, they just think they're so high and mighty. You're following God's law, but they don't see that because they are stumbling over these other things. So verse 17, for God's kingdom is not eating and drinking, but righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. Right? We won't be eating and drinking in the kingdom. We'll be spirit. We can if we want, but we don't have to. We spend time, right? Ideally, you're going to make a list up of things you need from the grocery store. You go into the grocery store, you're trying to find the right one to buy and the right price point to buy it at, and you're shopping through the whole store. We spend a lot of time doing that. You come home, you have to put it away, being frozen or refrigerated until you need it, or it goes in the pantry, and then the time to cook it and the time to clean up. We won't have any of that because we don't have to. So what should be there, right? That stuff is going to go away. So what continues forward? Righteousness, peace, joy in God's Spirit. 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 8 I have there. Paul writes here again, speaking of this matter, but food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. Right? For now, food is a vehicle to help sustain our life. But it's not righteousness on the level that it will continue into God's kingdom with us. It can become righteousness or unrighteousness depending on how we use it, right? And especially how we use it with each other. So he says we should focus on these other things rather than the contentions and the division over these meat markets. So he says in verse 18, for he who serves Christ in these things is acceptable to God and approved by men. Back up earlier, he asked the somewhat rhetorical question in verse 10, why do you judge your brother? In verse 4, who are you to judge another man's servant? Well, it's God. And if we do it properly, then we're acceptable to God, right? We've done the right thing. This is judgment. This is God saying, yes, I know what you will do with my Holy Spirit then, right? You won't use it to bludgeon each other. You won't use it to condemn each other. You won't use it and create division, contention and division, sorry. So he says, rather, I know that you'll have righteousness and peace and joy. That's what God finds acceptable. And when we have those things, then it's approved by men, even if others don't agree with us, right? We maybe hear this comment from time to time, used to hear it more decades ago when we were much larger numbers and we would go into a local community for a Feast of Tabernacles and people would say, I really like you people, right? You come in here, you're respectful, you don't destroy the store, you're happy, you don't give us grief, your children are well behaved, but you hit this really crazy religion, right? They just couldn't wrap their head around the religion and what we did, but they like the outcome. That's approved by men. They may not understand. They say, I like those people. I know they're not going to be contentious. They're not going to be nitpicky and needling things. And so verse 19, he says, so then, no different than the word therefore. So let us follow after the things which make for peace and the things by which we may build one another up. So even in a modern context, oftentimes when we get together, we'll ask somebody, you have any food allergies? Some people would say, I don't care. You're coming to my house. I'm providing the food. This is what I'm doing. And somebody may show up and say, well, there's nothing I can eat, as they start to ask what's in different things. And you may do that out of ignorance, but if you know and you're just going to do it anyway, that's not building up, is it? So I have 1 Corinthians 14:12 there, so I'll read that to you. Paul writes, even so, here speaking about tongues specifically, as he's followed through on the spiritual gifts and the attitude that was wrong with the congregation of Corinth, he says, so then, sorry, lost my place. Even so, since you are zealous for spiritual gifts, let it be for the edification of the church that you seek to excel. Right? The food is just the vehicle. The gifts were just the vehicle. What should be in our mind is excelling to the edification of others. That would reflect Jesus Christ, building one another up. So verse 20, don't overthrow God's work for food's sake. right? For something so temporary. It could be, it could be clothing. It could be, you know, any number of things that we tend to think are important in this life, where you live, where you went to school, what kind of job you have, just any number of things. Don't overthrow God's work for those temporary things, right? This life is the vehicle for us to grow into the character that will be taken into the life God seeks to give us. John 10:10, that abundant life, right? And yet we can make those things of such importance, humanly speaking, that that's what we think is important. You know, I would hate for my house to burn down. There are a lot of things in here I really like. That's why I have them in my house, right? But at the end of the day, they're things, aren't they? I can rebuild a house, I can buy new furniture, I can get new clothes, I can do all of those sort of things. But I could make that more important to the point where I treat other people so poorly that I don't build one another up, that I throw away God's kingdom, his offer of salvation for these physical things. And I've seen people do it. I'm sure you have as well. So continuing in verse 20, he says, all things indeed are clean. Again, I'll come back and add the word, all things indeed are clean that are clean. Right? So if the piece of beef is sitting next to the piece of pork, he says it's clean, it's okay. Right? However, it is evil for that man who creates a stumbling block by eating. And you could take it so far as to say, you know what? I bought this piece of meat. It was sitting right next to the piece of pork. I don't care. I fried it up, and here it is as I'm cutting it up and eating it. Saying that to another church member and showing them how wrong they are. Paul says that's evil. Don't do that. Verse 21, it is good not to eat meat, drink wine, nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or offended or is made weak. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't have conversations with them. It doesn't mean that over time they can't grow to see these things as well, to come to a point where they recognize, if you do, that this doesn't mean anything, right? It's okay. But in the meantime, don't press the point. I mentioned the story about my wife's brother drinking wine, drinking alcohol, but again, it could be anything. It could be the food that we have or don't have. It could be all these other things. Do we look out for the possibility we might offend somebody or create a stumbling block for somebody? So Proverbs 23, let me go back there and we can read that as well. Proverbs 23, starting in verse 20, Solomon writes here, he says, do not mix with wine bibbers or gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe a man with rags. Meaning, we could create an issue. So let's take it a little step further, since he's brought up wine here. What if we insist that it's not a problem? If you're coming to my house, I don't care that you have a problem with it. I'm going to have a glass of wine. And what if then that creates a problem for them, a moment of weakness that they stumble, and now they go back to drinking wine? It could be food in general. You could have gluttonous. You could have somebody that's anorexic. To at least consider these things. Why would we want to do that? So verse 22, do you have faith? Now, this is not a question that it might appear to be at first. Do you have faith? No, what he's saying is, in light of all of this, right? The whole chapter 14 here, right? You've argued over meat. He's brought up wine a couple of times here. So there's maybe a potential that alcohol was a problem as well, where that came from or how much they had. There were probably other things that contributed to this matter of judging and causing others to stumble. So he's asking the question, and maybe I put a little more into it as well, if I have license there. Do you think you have faith? In light of what what I've just said, all that I've just said, do you still think you have faith? So he says, whatever it is, though, have it to yourself before God. right? If you're okay with that, going back up to verse 6 and 7, right? None of us lives to himself and none of us dies to himself. Verse 8, if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord, right? In the end, that's who judges us. So have it to yourself. If that's the faith you have it to yourself. Paul says, I think it should grow. I think it should be so that you build one another up. Verse 19. I think it should be so that it ends up being acceptable to God and approved by men in verse 18. That you're not creating a stumbling block by doing these things in verse 20. I think it should be that. But if you disagree, then have it to yourself. Happy is he who doesn't judge himself in that which he approves, right? I'm only eating what is clean from the meat market, right? I approve of myself. I judge myself to be holy before God, perfect before God. Well, that's the reward you're going to have, isn't it? Part of our calling is questioning, and it's not questioning to doubt. That's when we get ourselves in trouble. We allow human nature, we allow Satan's influence to make us question. That's not why we should pay attention to these things, to create doubt. We should pay attention to it to make sure we're doing the right thing, because we can drift into habits, right? Most of us have that little sticker on the windshield, somewhere on the windshield, that says when we should change the oil. Right, the manufacturer says every 5,000 miles. I do it roughly every 7 to 8,000 because I've talked to many mechanics. They say it doesn't really matter that many miles. I actually talked to one mechanic I used to know years and years ago. He says, actually, you can go 10 or more thousand miles. He says, the important thing is do it regularly. Whatever interval you think, depending on what kind of driving you're doing. He says, city driving, I'd probably do it more often. Highway driving, it doesn't need to be done that often. But the point is to do it regularly. But if we don't have that sticker up there, we forget, right? I don't remember the mileage last time I got my oil changed. And so that sticker is a good reminder of when I need to do it. That's what he's getting to. That's what I read from this. Are we questioning ourselves, not to doubt, but to make sure, am I doing the right thing? Is this the right circumstance? Is this the right thing to say? Is this the right thing to do? Not only for my own sake, right? Do I have faith? Not only for my own sake, but to make sure that I'm not causing someone else to doubt their calling, to question, or to do the wrong thing. And to make sure that we're making progress. Maybe at times we think we are doing the right thing. And from what we know and understand in that point in time, we are. But then we continue to grow in grace and knowledge. And God shows us, I've mentioned this a couple of times as I give messages. I don't keep the Sabbath the same way I did as a 15-year-old boy. I've learned things over the years. If I'm not learning things, that would make me question. One of the most, trying to think of the right word, sad things, not really sad. There's more than sadness there. I shake my head. I've heard this a couple of times in my experience as a pastor, where I've had individuals come to me and they'll say, in light of me encouraging them to do more, to serve more, to set a better example, to be at church more, whatever it happens to be, they'll say, I'm beyond that. What they're saying is, I'm good enough. And it stuns me every time I hear it. And I'll say, show me that in scripture where God says, if you get to this point, you can coast the rest of the way, right? You're good as gold. I don't find that anywhere in scripture, because human nature and Satan's influence, there's always going to be something. And if we think we're at the pinnacle of wherever it is we need to be, we're usually in a place we should pay attention to, because it's not good. We've become comfortable with this life. We've become comfortable with our decisions, our judging ourselves, as he says there in verse 22 and even earlier, right? We've judged ourselves to have made it. And this is the condemnation of the church of Laodicea in Revelation 3, right? I'm increased and I'm good, right? I have everything I need. And God says, you don't see that you're miserable and you're poor and you're blind and you're naked. You're missing everything else. So if we're going to question, we have to question ourselves first. We can help to teach. We can help set the example. And so we should be very careful not to create stumbling blocks, and especially so that we're not judging one another in terms of salvation. So verse 23, he concludes this chapter by saying, but he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because it isn't of faith. Right? Meaning condemned is a very strong word in our English. It just simply means he's judged, right? If we do something we think is not right, and that's happened at times in my life where I do something and originally think it's okay, and then as I start to consider it, it's like, I really shouldn't do that. Right? It wasn't proper. It isn't of the faith, to add a declarative in there. He says, whatever is not of faith is sin. So he begins this chapter, as I say there, in the same way that he ended it. If you go back up and notice, he says, right, that we're not to judge one another, and we're not to do it, especially in light of someone who's weak and wants to have an argument. So he kind of puts bookends on this. Now, I'll make a note here, because depending on your translation, some translations will add a couple more verses here at the end of this. And they've done that because there's disagreement amongst scholars and theologians as to what was done with the ending of this book of Romans. No one disputes that Paul wrote it. What's in dispute is that some see in chapter 15 and chapter 16, to jump ahead, we'll cover this more as we get to those, that there seems to be a double doxology. And a doxology is simply, basically, right, a prayer. Jude does this at the end of his letter, where you ask this blessing to be upon people. Other books have a similar thing at the end. Well, there's one in chapter 15 and one in chapter 16. And so some say, well, those chapters were added because it seems like Paul's finished, and then he seems to finish again. Some will highlight that in chapter 16, there are greetings mentioned to certain people that weren't mentioned earlier in the book. And so then some will say, well, then this book was edited, right? It was changed, somebody added, somebody deleted, whatever it happens to be. And they'll use that not as a point of clarification or considering what is in those chapters of importance. They usually do it to dismiss, right? So this has been changed. We can't count on this being the word of God. Well, there's a longer discussion, and maybe I'll get into that next time as well, that the final person to edit the New Testament canon was John, the Apostle John. We even have in Paul, some of Paul's writings, he's asking Timothy to bring the parchments, right? Why would he need these other letters? Paul mentions as well, and now that I'm bringing it up, I will bring that up next time. We'll go into some of that, because Peter and Paul seemed to recognize that God was inspiring writings that needed to be preserved. And so Mark's gospel account, Matthew's gospel account, Luke's gospel account, and Paul's writings, and then later even Jude and James, and of course the gospel accounts and the epistles that John wrote in Revelation. John was the one that finalized it, if you will, the canonization of the New Testament, much like Ezra did for the Old Testament. And so I find no disparity here. I find no concern, because John probably had other letters. We know there were other letters that Paul wrote that are not preserved for us. He wrote a letter to the church at Laodicea. All right, it wasn't preserved probably because it was similar thoughts to many of the other letters that he wrote. Or it didn't need to be preserved. Maybe it was more direct to them as opposed to more of a general Christian living sort of thing that more people needed to know about or understand or apply. So I don't have a problem with editing, because everything that we have stands together. There's no disagreement. There's no break, if you will, in what God inspired to be recorded. So we'll get into that next time. But I wanted to highlight that, because there are some that will add a couple more verses. They'll take it from the end of 16 and they'll put it here, thinking that these 14 chapters were the original book, and that's really all we should have. But there's still some important things in chapter 15 and 16. So we'll leave it there for today, and we'll come back next time with chapter 15.